this computer. I've never done this before, so I hope this recording works, but it looks like we're recording. Okay, but yeah, thank you guys for having me today. My name is Ann Wells. I'm a first year MD PhD student at the University of Texas in San Antonio. And besides studying for the lung, which is kind of what we're doing right now, I spent a lot of time thinking about really neuropsychiatry. That's kind of like my field of interest. It's sort of a relatively new field. It's kind of trying to join in methods of neurology with psychiatric illness. And I like to say it's the science for the mind. We already have the science for the brain, but we got to put those two things together. So that's what I think about a lot. But I also think a lot about race. I think a lot about anti-racism. I'm currently working on a distinction project in medical education that's really focused on anti-racism in every level you can think of. But my project is going to be kind of focused on curriculum, and in particular, how we talk about race and how we talk about race with sometimes causality with disease and associations with disease. And so I wanted to present this paper today because it really touches on what I think all the papers should be like for this as a model paper, a model study, a model discussion, really. And I hope you guys kind of agree with me. So my presentation today is called Does Race Confound Mere-Difference? I'm going to talk about what mere-difference is, but then this is applied to cognitive deficiencies in multiple sclerosis in Black and Hispanic adults. So this is a paper, if anyone wants to look it up, I think it was kind of shared in like at the ad for this talk, but this is about a year old, coming out in neurology, talking about race, ethnicity, and cognition in persons with newly diagnosed multiple sclerosis. It's kind of important that it is newly diagnosed, and I'll kind of get into that as well as a lot of different like methods and tools that they've used for this. So first, I'm going to give an introduction on MS, which I think I'm kind of preaching to the choir here about. So let me know if you get bored. But then I'm going to kind of talk about race and MS and race and disability, and kind of how the idea that why would we look at race for multiple sclerosis in the first place? And then, of course, kind of bring this discussion back to looking at race. How can we tease apart race from a different cognitive tests? The methods used, this is like a massive cohort study coming out of Kaiser Permanente, using a couple different tests that I'll talk about too. And their hypothesis was literally just to see if Black or Hispanic patients with newly diagnosed MS were more likely to have cognitive impairment compared to white patients with also newly diagnosed MS. I'm going to jump to the conclusion for you. In case you're sitting on the edge of your seat wondering, oh my God, is race causal? No, it is not. Just to quell any anxieties you may have about what the conclusion is going to be. But what is interesting is that there is race difference with these cognitive tests that they use. And so that's kind of the central kind of line of the conclusion of this paper. And I think kind of one of the more interesting aspects as well. Okay, so multiple sclerosis, we know that this is an autoimmune condition that preferentially, in a simplistic way, is looking at attack of myelin sheaths. It tends to affect peripheral nerves. And so myelin is kind of like all over the place, but in particular, there are big bundles of myelin around massive nerves, especially affecting muscle tissue and skeletal muscle in particular. We have skeletal muscle on our arms, on our legs, and our back. And so the first initial symptoms of multiple sclerosis may be some weakness, some deficiency in being able to use these large muscle groups, but ultimately it affects a lot. You have a lot of skeletal muscle in your face. You have a lot that allows you to speak, to make eye contact, to make general nonverbal symbols and cues in communication. And so very quickly in the disease, we also see deficiencies in this way. And because of that, we tend to also have, I don't know if you guys can see, oh no, let's get a laser pointer. Can you guys see my pointer? Okay, so we end up getting kind of this psychological breakdown, also multiple sclerosis, that happens very quickly. And a lot of it is because of kind of these deficiencies in being able to express yourself, to communicate pain, to communicate changes in your abilities. And that kind of comes out of that. So that's kind of where my interest is in multiple sclerosis, but it all ties in together, and this is highly variable. It's common that you may have depression, grief, anger, all sorts of things, especially behavioral changes out of necessity, but also out of a reluctance to kind of continue certain behaviors. So that's kind of like one of the defining features of MS. Now I can't, oh, there we go. Okay. So where this comes into play with mere-difference is that you become effectively disabled And in a lot of people, it's at a very young age. It preferentially kind of favors women to some degree, as we understand now. And so your life totally changes with this diagnosis. In the realm of disability, there's a lot of kind of theory around how we treat disability, how we treat the disabled. And patients with multiple sclerosis squarely fit into kind of this gray area, navigating once fully able now into disability. And so one of my models and one of my like theories of mind that I kind of like to point to for this is the mere-difference model. This is from Elizabeth Barnes. She wrote a really nice book about mere-difference and bad difference in disabilities. And I have the reference on the next slide if anyone's really interested. But what she's kind of tapping into is this research in bias. So we know that there's bias. We know that clinicians are humans. We come fully packaged with our own biases from birth. We learn them throughout our life. And biases often enter into the clinical realm. And so in terms of bias for disabilities or even chronic illness, having some kind of bias as to how a patient may perform normal functions, what they may prefer as far as treatment plans, what their access to a COVID shot, which is kind of like relevant right now, is all kind of driven by these same underlying biases. And here I just kind of define like the two main branches that Elizabeth Barnes uses. Here's the book that she wrote, The Minority Body. And it really kind of chapter 2 really talks about this. So you can understand based on what's called the social model, this idea of disability as being just a mere difference. It is something that you have. It does not necessarily affect every single aspect of your health and your life, but it is something that we have to account for. It is not something that makes you fundamentally useless, fundamentally not a part of society, fundamentally not willing to be treated. And that's often kind of how it comes to. This is opposed to kind of the medical model, which there's some problematic naming of this, I believe, but it is kind of the traditional model that disability or chronic illness is a bad difference, meaning it is something like cancer or the flu. It is something that could kill you. It's something that makes you fragile, makes you not worthy of treating aggressively. It's something that is malignant. It is something that is terminal. And so it's something that, you might as well just kind of live out the rest of your days peacefully with. And there's striking, I'm trying to draw out the striking differences between these two things because oddly enough, she kind of put race in this mere difference category, kind of explicitly, along with gender or religions, kind of these like social factors that are driven by other social factors that should not necessarily determine the outcome of your health or your health care. Nonetheless, historically, race has been considered to be something more of a bad difference. And in theory, this paper that I'm presenting today is kind of drawing from that. It's saying that, well, typically it's thought that Hispanic and Black patients don't do as well in these cognitive tests when they have first presented for MS, when they have first presented for a lot of different neurological conditions. And so if they don't perform as well outright, they must have a more accelerated disability, and therefore their plan for treatment and their plan for chronic care is different fundamentally. I just really like these cartoons. I think it kind of like accentuates a little bit what I'm saying, but with some humor. And so what we're trying to get at for like mere difference model, we'd like to move more towards a mere difference model for treatment of anything, to be fair. But a lot of it is kind of just saying, well, we're trying our best to help you, but you're still broken. And so we can't do anything about that. And that's a bad difference. This kind of exemplifies a bad difference, right? So we remove barriers for you, but you are still tragic victims. Oh, poor you. What's the matter with you, dear? Apart from your attitude and these barriers, you mean? Like, are we really doing enough for those who are disabled? Are we really seeing them as people who are fully worthy of healthcare that they should deserve? And this is kind of one of my favorite doodles as far as equity goes. Equity is a really important word and term that we use that is different from equality. And it's importantly different from equality because it's saying that we need to be able to treat people slightly differently, maybe, to make sure that they have the same elevated health status, the same elevated position in society to excel in their own unique way, not in like a cookie cutter way. So an elephant necessarily must be treated and have a different exam to have to climb the tree that is different from the monkey. That must be different for the penguin. I don't even know how the penguin would get up there, to be fair. The fish in the bowl, no idea. But, you know, some of these patients are fish in a bowl, and we have to kind of figure out what healthcare looks like for them. And then I just kind of threw this in here. We can circle back to it, but I found this really interesting article from this Black patient who wrote this. Definitely, I'll share the slides, but you should like get the link and really read this out. Her argument is we really need to figure out what sick looks like and what disabled looks like. And I really like the way, the patient is Lauren Hooten-Work. She's just a Black millennial. She's not a physician or anything. She's just talking about her diagnosis of MS as a young woman and kind of like what that changed in her life. That's kind of the theme of the article. But being Black, being a woman is hard enough today. Having a diagnosis of MS on top of that is even worse. And it doesn't have to be worse, I think is kind of her main message. But in case anyone's looking at real patient voices about this, she's a good one. Definitely speaks better than I can about this. All right, so the paper. So the paper, again, is coming out of a large cohort study from Kaiser Permanente. They essentially recruited over some number of years, I wanna say maybe 5 or 10 years, people who are coming in at different Kaiser Permanente sites, and they were diagnosed either with MS, which is multiple sclerosis, or like kind of alternative MS appearing diagnoses. That's what CIS stands for. And ultimately, they got 554 of these patients. They were all adults. They were used with matched controls, so people without MS or CIS, and they controlled for a lot of things. There's a big table that I'll show you kind of looking at that, but race, ethnicity, age twice shouldn't be there, just age once. Sex, which facility you went to, symptom onset date, so was it truly early onset, how early is early, they kind of assess that as well. They used an oral SDMT instrument, so symbol digit modalities test. I'll show you what that looks like as far as like a reading output. This is typically done orally for MS patients. And essentially it's a test of cognition, but it's also like a psychomotor ability test if you use it in the touch modalities. So I'll talk a little about that. And then they did a verbal fluency test to determine if you should have this in English or in Spanish, which is important for factors I'll get to later as well. And so they basically used this SDMT test. They did multivariate regression modeling on it just to see what were the differences between MS, non-MS patients, and all these controls. Before I get into the results though, just to kind of tell you a bit more about the instrument, I thought it was really cool. I never really heard of it before. So the simple digit modalities test can go for different ways. I think most often for MS, it's usually oral, just because it is kind of a bit more of a motor test if you really do it full on. But essentially what you get is at the top here, you have like these symbols, and the symbols can be like whatever. But more importantly, each symbol is unique and it's matched to a number at the bottom. So the idea here is you have like kind of a blank grid with like a random assortment of symbols. And the idea is either orally or by filling in the number yourself, you're supposed to match. So let's say I have an equal sign here. That is 3. I'm supposed to put 3 in this box, or verbalize 3, depending on what I'm doing. And I'm supposed to do that and try to get all of these rows, all of these boxes as fast as I can. And the measure is accuracy. So am I getting by memory, mostly, the correct number to the correct symbol when I'm doing this? And then how fast do I do it? On average, there is like sort of a normalized scale. This is a highly like sensitive and replicable scale. So it's been like used widely, which is interesting in itself, but it's not often been done in multiple languages. It's mostly validated in English. It's also mostly been validated by writing. Not so many people have validated studies showing like an oral demonstration of this test. So that is kind of an important caveat. The readout kind of looks like something on the right where, okay, I figured out like these are the symbols, and by kind of like a bubble analysis, you can see how often people got errors wrong. You can see that people do fine in the beginning, they get tired, they get really confused, different symbols, maybe one symbol comes up only one time. So there's a lot of different things you can kind of throw in to really trip someone up. But it's a very simple test, a very fast test to really measure a lot of different things. So that was the main instrument that they used. And again, the hypothesis, are Black and Hispanic patients with newly diagnosed multiple sclerosis more likely to have cognitive impairment than white patients? And again, no. I'm just going to give you the answer. It's no. But how did they get there? So they administered this test to over 1,000 people. And what they came up with on the left here, these are the controls. So these are people without multiple sclerosis, and these are their distributions on like performance of the test by score, which again is a scaled kind of system using accuracy and speed as its outputs, and kind of number of participants are on the Y. In blue, you see the output for white patients. In green, you see Hispanic, and in red, you see Black patients. So this is distributed by race. Essentially, what you see between people without multiple sclerosis and people with multiple sclerosis is some difference. The difference is particular really just to having multiple sclerosis. In the next table, I'll show you it is also due to education level and like some fluency interactions with that. But for the most part, you see a roughly equal distribution of like white patients tend to be on top, Hispanic patients tend to be in the middle, Black patients tend to be on the bottom. It's hard to see with these two graphs kind of in this way, but if you overlap them, there is some left shift in all of the curves for the multiple sclerosis patients and to nearly the same effect, indicating that even early in multiple sclerosis, there appears to be some cognitive deficiency with multiple sclerosis. That is complex, and they do kind of talk about that in the discussion, which I'll get to, but that is the most significant difference here, is literally having MS as far as your SDMT score readout. There are notable differences between the races, but that effect was the same across races. It was the same also across everything else. So age, education level, fluency, so like language, giving the test in Spanish or in English really had no effect. And so all of that was kind of held constant as well. Here's the big fat stats table. I apologize that I didn't get to break this down a little bit more, but what it kind of shows you is kind of the sum of what I just said. So the idea here is that they controlled for sex, age, education, really just kind of in two subcategories. So with college or just kind of finishing high school or less, right? They did by income level, and this is a little bit nuanced because it was based on like a California level of poverty level, not a federal level. However, you're getting like a local community, local recruitment anyway into this study. And so it's not super confounding, but that's kind of the reality nuance of that. And then just kind of like vague with white as the referent, which is problematic, but Hispanic and Black breakdowns. Black does not include Hispanic Blacks. So that's kind of like specifically separated, and then having multiple sclerosis or not. And so what you see is that if you're looking at like race-wise, there is a difference that is more attributed to education, right, versus anything else. As far as an MS difference, that was a significant difference across MS and controls. So like controls in your cases, right? But otherwise, education was a difference. So having really high school or less, anything above high school didn't really make a difference. Being older wasn't like a huge difference. Sex-wise, not a huge difference either. And that's kind of, those are kind of like the major statistical findings. So for their discussion, I really just kind of like screenshotted because I thought they said things very well. But in particular, they said in black and white, we did not find any evidence that MS causes more cognitive impairment in Black or Hispanic patients early in the disease course compared to white patients. That's really important. It's really important for the reasons I was speaking of before with mere difference versus bad difference. These are patients who were recently diagnosed. So recently diagnosed in their definition was like less than a couple of months, okay? Does that mean that they have more severe impairments as like a more accelerated version of their disease? Unclear. But from the point of diagnosis, from the point of being in a clinician's room and under the care of a clinician, right, there are no differences. If that's your point A, and you look at these same patients in like a year or 10 years, if you're lucky, where do they land? Because we have assumed racial differences. Unclear. And that's really kind of what they're getting at here. They're there are assumed differences, but there are not actual differences. And a lot of this is because of cognitive tests. So historically, cognitive tests have not been super well balanced. They've mostly studied white males. They've not really had a diverse population of patients to deal with. This is probably one of the first and most diverse studies that they've done with this particular battery. And this is really only a small part of the battery of cognitive tests that are given to MS patients. So if we were to expand this to the other tests, I feel like that would be really interesting. But they just picked this one because it's so notorious. And I mean, frankly, the racial differences are underlying. So if education is confounding in this, which it was, then obviously it's not a racial issue. It's the fact that people may not have actually had enough exposure to math. They may not be as comfortable with symbols or numbers to be able to perform on this test well. If you have anxiety based on that, I can't imagine doing anything quickly with numbers would be in your strong suit. And especially as an oral test, it's not something that's private. It's something that you're right now giving your answers to, which is a little bit more of a nuanced kind of take on that test, but it's an important one. And I thought this quote was really interesting. So, pervasive racial and ethnic disparities can affect performance on neuropsychological tests by depriving groups of reaching their full potential. Again, they're studying these patients that are newly diagnosed with MS. If this is your first battery of tests and you're not so good with numbers and you're not so good at any of the other tests simply because you've never been good at testing, maybe you underlying have dyslexia, maybe you literally don't know how to read, maybe giving a test in English or Spanish doesn't matter for you because you're not going to perform well anyway on it, then that's being driven to your diagnosis. It's being tied to your treatment and tied to your prognosis. So it just kind of starts in a bad place, I think is kind of what the conclusion was. Taken together with findings from other non-MS studies, these findings also highlight a troubling societal problem in the United States. So I think there is a lot kind of loaded into this statement, but some of the idea is that if you are basing science off of racial difference, presumed racial difference, right? And we are just willingly giving a battery of tests that have not been tested in a diverse population, which is really, I think, kind of the main issue here. What are you actually testing? What is your output and what is your normal curve? You know, going back briefly, here, right? In all cases, right, we would have one curve here. That would be our normal curve. And that normal curve that's based, that has previously, before this paper been used to base where you are as far as like your initial diagnosis for MS, is only really based on white patients. And so if you are Black, what they're saying is you have your own normal curve, right? Here's your normal curve. You're shifted over to the left just as much as any other patient, but your shift may be confounded and shifted further, and you may have a lower cognitive ability on paper than you may actually have. And that's a big issue. It changes the way that patients and doctors interact. It changes how I talk to you. It changes how like your disability affects your life. Do you get to continue with school? Are you encouraged to continue with your job? You know, it just kind of changes everything. And so why does it matter to me? So I think I've kind of like harped on this enough, but bad differences are bad differences. And if you make something a bad difference, then it can really affect the rest of someone's life. Early bias in diagnosis can adversely affect treatment outcomes, and it adversely affects like more than that. It's the relationship between the patient and the doctor. It's the knowledge and the standing of a patient on their own ground. Like how advanced do they think they are? How capable do they think they are? You know, I think a lot of the literature, and especially Elizabeth Barnes' work, points to poor treatment outcomes, and in general, it can affect a lot of different things. So for example, recently with COVID, we've had to create new guidelines that allow for people with disabilities to have different grades as far as like considering ventilators, considering actually getting on treatment, or just being sent home to die. It's really been kind of a life or death kind of question, depending on your state for your treatment outcomes. And that affects a lot of different things. COVID is just a recent example. And of course, kind of where I sit, how does this affect your mind, your emotions, your psyche, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation? If I'm given a poor prognosis because of a cognitive test that is not exactly accurate, what chances do I really have to have a good life after that? And I think, honestly, so the article that I referenced earlier, by Lauren is actually a really good kind of analysis and take on that. But in the end, we need more research. This is just one paper. We need 1 to 10 of these papers for every single condition that has been tied to race in some way. We need to untangle this issue of race and disability, ethnicity and age and sex and gender, because it is important. And if you're not writing a grant, including all of these different factors, you're not doing worthwhile research, in my opinion. So that's my hard take on that. But that is all I have. Definitely open to any other questions anyone has on any aspect of this.
Thank you, Anne. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
I'm going to open it up to the floor to see if anybody else has any questions.
I have questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Len.
Can you go back to that table you showed?
Yes. Let's see. Here we go. This one?
Yes. Okay. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this.
Yeah, it's
so what this is showing is, so I see the total that's combining both the controls and the cases together into one cohort for the analysis.
Correct.
So it's saying that controlling for age, sex, so this is male as the baseline,
right.
Education. So all of these have, so here with the race part in reference to white and controlling for all these other factors.
Correct.
The p-value for these are pretty low. And then when you get to the cases, okay, that's interesting. When you get to the cases, you don't see this difference here with the 0.0758. I'm not arguing that the authors drew the wrong conclusion, but I'm curious why they drew their conclusion the way they did, given that it seems like for these beta in the total and in the controls, and I guess in the cases for Black patients, it seems like these are low p-values, which deem the variables to be different comparing to white individuals. So I'm curious, what's your take on that?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess just to clarify, the authors found a race difference apart from MS, right? So I guess the ranking order of difference in their conclusions was MS, like having MS was the biggest difference between like all factors, accounting for everything, because it was like a multivariate regression, right?
Got it. So you're saying because this beta is really big,
yes,
the total, the difference between the control and the cases, that difference is reliant on MS itself, not so much race. And then even here you see in the cases, which is between patients, there's not even a beta for that. So
correct. Well, so there's not a beta for that.
There shouldn't be. Yeah, there shouldn't be because it's
yeah,
MS.
exactly.
Yeah,
kind of the referent control. But importantly, there were race differences. So and you can see like that's evident in the graph, right?
Yeah.
Like white patients tend to be like outnumbered in their controls. That's like that's one reality, right?
Yeah.
And then Black patients were underrepresented, and that's something that they also acknowledge. But the representation for the local community was balanced, I guess. So population-wise, around California, it made a lot of sense. If you were to repeat this in New York, if you were to do this in Houston, I think you would have different curves. I think no matter what they were saying is white graph would always be slightly more shifted right compared to the other ones. And that tends to be the case. And that difference itself was significant, but not due to MS. So MS was not the effect of racial difference here. And I think that's really kind of what this table is pointing out. So again, this is the totals, this is controls. So people without MS being compared as the referent, right? And then for each of these effects, I guess really kind of more of a bivariate analysis, maybe not multivariate. They added MS with age, MS with sex, right? I think somewhere in like a supplemental, they did do kind of more of a multivariate analysis with this with everything piled onto MS and let their SPSS kind of run and like hope for the best. But in simplicity, I think that's what they're showing here in this table. And so that's why in cases, p-values kind of go out of whack with education and income, and they go out of whack with being Hispanic, but not necessarily with Black. And I think their major conclusions are pointing to the fact that underlying with MS, right, and race, that was confounding. Like race was significantly confounding here, but not across the board, right? It's like white patients were not affected by race, right? Hispanic patients were particularly not as affected, smaller p-value, not like crazy small, compared to white patients, but Black patients in particular had an effect of race and MS. And so that is notable. And I think that's kind of what the graphs and this table are trying to show. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I completely understand, but I'm also not sure where I'm not completely understand. So maybe I'll think about it.
Yeah, it's kind of tough. I had to look at this table a few times, but and maybe it's not the best table, to be fair. It's busy, and it's showing like that Black people with MS do really, really bad. I think that's the basic conclusion on this one cognitive test.
But I think that's part of the question that you kind of, this whole thing brings about is, what is this test testing, right? Because is it testing cognition in the way that we define it in a broad general sense that we all say the cognition of a Black person or a white person is essentially this, like, or is it testing something that is specific to some population? And we also probably know that it's not race, but it's something underlying race. And should we also, kind of try and understand what's happening there?
Exactly. And I think importantly, there's a difference between white and Black controls and white and Black with MS.
Yeah.
And like statistically, this was the same difference. That's what they were trying to show, I think. It's not, so like there's already sort of a cognitive difference between whites and Blacks. That's not causal based on race, right? It's causal based on lots of other things like education, income. I mean, they didn't measure like stress. They didn't measure safety, security, green space. Like there's a lot of like different measures that they could have used. I think they use very basic things to try to accentuate these differences. But I think maybe what you're looking for is actually just in the controls.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know if I can make the claim that there's actually a score difference between different races within the control based on what you're seeing here, because the heights are just number of participant, but
right, it's kind of
distribution.
Where the are. So like it's really hard to see, but maybe I can draw.
Yeah.
So here's the Black peak. Oh no, that's not right. Oh, that didn't work. Let's see if highlighter works. No, it's not working. Cool. Okay, but you can see maybe the laser pointer is better anyway. Or maybe I can, no, it probably won't work. Okay, so here's a Black peak, right? This is at like 54, 55 as far as the score goes, right? The white peak is squarely at 60, maybe 62, right? So there's already like, they're not perfectly aligned curves. That's kind of what they're looking at. Here, obviously, it's like a large shift. Like the Black curve is pretty far over to the right. White and Hispanic were nearly aligned though, which is interesting. And there's kind of like a 10-point difference here actually between them two. So the race effect is real. Whether it is causal to like their cognition is difficult to tease apart. That's not causal. I think that's kind of like what they were trying to say.
Yeah, I like that conclusion they made of kind of just, we're using this to now treat you as this is your normal curve, and this is, and it's still a brute, like crude way of dissecting it, but still it's something that's better than what we were using before. It's just one step forward at least.
Exactly. And like I said before, this is just one of maybe 10 battery kind of tests that they give to patients. So you really need to see studies on every other aspect of cognitive testing. This is very particularly a psychomotor type of test, typically. And even so, if you're not pointing to the number, if you're not physically writing the number down, it's been validated in some part, at least, to be able to use orally. So it's very particular. And yes, if you're basing the entirety of your initial treatment and prognosis on this one test, I think it would be flawed. I don't think that's kind of like the standard, but it's a very key part, and it's a very quick and easy thing that people look at first. And that first diagnosis, that first influence is really kind of the big one.
I think when I was reading the paper, what I understood, and I read it like a few weeks ago, so bear with me. But I think exactly what was presented on in that in all of the race groups, white, Hispanic, and Black, early MS or newly diagnosed MS did cause some sort of cognitive deficit as measured by the SDMT. But they didn't find that it was greater in Blacks than whites or Hispanics than whites. What I do find interesting is that, and again, this is what we were just talking about, in both the controls and the newly diagnosed MS cases, Blacks do have, it looks like a more of a left shift. So they do have a, on average, lower score. And I think, again, like what kind of implications does that have? And this kind of like goes into a discussion I want to have with the group, like, do we need to validate these cognitive tests in larger, more diverse groups? Like, how do we go about that? How do we go about validating these cognitive tests and other tests that have traditionally been validated in, as Anne had mentioned, white males and these larger defined groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's tough. I think being at Kaiser gives you a very particular opportunity to do a multi-facility type study like this. The fact that they had over 1,000 MS patients or 1,000 participants and like over 500 MS patients themselves was really big. But this is not particularly difficult testing that they're doing. You know what I mean? The factors that they're accounting for are not like crazy. The SDMT is very commonly used. And so I could see them kind of like using different universities, different hospital systems to try to like expand this network, especially to get more Black representation. And I do feel like if you're kind of looking at that on a US scale, right, you're still going to have to say, okay, let's not overrepresent Black, let's not overrepresent Hispanic. But I mean, in my mind, this tends to be kind of like the distribution of race across MS patients generally. I would be more interested to see a sex difference. I think they did have more males in this study, whereas my understanding is that MS does affect more women.
I thought I saw it was like 71% female.
Was it 71% female, or was it opposite?
Maybe it was 71% male. Maybe that's what I saw.
No, it says most were female, 71%.
Yeah.
Okay.
71% female.
I remember that. I wrote because I wanted to ask about that. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I knew it was not balanced. I couldn't remember which way. But yeah, there needs to be some balance there, I think. But women are more affected. And so if they're overrepresented, that makes sense as far as an MS sampling. Yeah, I feel like we gotta fix this. This is not a hard test. It's just one test, but it's not a hard one to replicate and to validate.
Yeah, I feel like the first journal club we had, I think that was December. I feel like it's kind of coming down to these same questions of just like, what the things that we're using, are they actually applicable to the population that we're treating, right? Like we just need to know that, it's just a simple question. It's like, this is where, some of them have been, some of them like this one, we know how it is now, but there's other tests that we haven't touched or, nobody's looked at in 50 years and we're just going with it. So hopefully we'll be doing this.
I kind of want to open this for the larger group to have a discussion. So if you have a thought or, if you have a reaction to the information that's presented or the discussion, like, please feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. But I think that, and we had this conversation, as Guy mentioned in our last journal club. Okay, we want to make sure that we're validating these tests in all different populations. But these are self-identified and they're kind of like, you can't just put someone in like a Hispanic box or a Black box or a white box. Like, Black can mean a lot of different things. Are you African-American? Are you Afro-American? Are you like from Africa straight up? Or like Hispanic, like, are you Puerto Rican? Are you Mexican? Are you, Guatemalan, Argentinian? White also, like, you have it's just not a very well-defined group. And so, how do you make those definitions? And they're For the most part, they're self-identified, but also B, if there are differences like we're seeing here, what is that like, you know, do we need better designed tests so that we don't find differences, or, you know, what is that telling us? Those are just my thoughts.
One thing I want to add here is I feel like I can't draw, I definitely can find the conclusion that they show where there's, at least in the cases, there's like that difference between Black patients and white patients. I can understand them showing that, but I can't see how like the race difference would be a valid thing if they also don't show me disease severity. And as Anne was mentioning, yes, you could be coming in at 2 months, like within 2 months of your diagnosis, but people come in for MS diagnosis as varying stages of their disease severity. And you could live for a long time with no problems. And then you come in like, oh, now I have a brain lesion. And I'm like at EDSS level, something, that's really high. So there's no data on disease severity. There's no data on brain lesions, brain volume, anything like that. So I feel like I can't make any definitive conclusions about whether or not race actually matters for the SDMT.
Yeah, I think just on that note, something that's not reflected in the table, but how they selected patients and also like their exclusion criteria were based on complete health records because they were in the Kaiser Permanente system. So it looks like they were able to control for like literally looking through all inpatient and outpatient encounters, diagnostic tests, diagnoses, medications that they take, different things like that. They don't really, and that's just definitely a flaw. I would have liked a table that showed just fundamental like disease severity or a graph or something like that. But they kind of vaguely alluded to the fact that they controlled for what early could mean. They did not really explicitly define that except for time after diagnosis, which is concerning. And I think what you're saying is totally valid.
Kind of
some thoughts. Yeah, go ahead. I'll open it up to the group.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of along those lines, like talking about disease severity and MS. It's kind of funny, this timing of this, but I recently was reading Brain and Life. They have a special edition on MS, and they were talking about MS and race. That's the cover of the magazine. And one thing they were saying is that like MS very much is seen as like a white person's disease, and like a lot of med students and doctors were taught this. And like, while maybe like MS specialists are starting to realize that like that is not the case, a lot of like general neurologists still kind of have that framework in their mind. And so how that really plays into this is like a lot of Black patients will be diagnosed later and like may be presenting with more severe symptoms at the point that they get their diagnosis. And so I'm just kind of curious with this article, they do control for like time from diagnosis to like when they took this test. But like, again, coming back to this point that Lynn was making, like, how do we really know the severity that they're coming in with at this point?
Really good point, yeah.
Something else I'd just like to add real quick. I mean, it's a funny thing I just tested on today. So other things that, I mean, I used to be a data analyst, so I'm looking at this from a different perspective as well, from the numbers end. I used to live in Boston, which is a complete opposite end of Kaiser Permanente. And they have a whole different system over there, partner system, the Harvard system. And I assure you they would have a completely different demographic population, even if you get the same number of distribution of Black and Hispanic and everything. The Hispanics up there, the Black community up there is completely different. We have a lot of Creole up there, a lot of people on the islands as well. It's like compared to the other side, which have more Hispanics coming straight from Mexico. So that, and I'm saying this only because I used to work on a team that looks at the stuff specifically, because I was in a safety net hospital. So who's going to end up going to those, like those such demographics? Another thing is confounding variables that are related to the health of the people, especially the women. So funny, I'm not sure if anyone knows this, but like pregnancy, for example, is protective against MS relapse. So if someone comes in pregnant, their severity is going to be way low compared to, so even if they had it for like 2 years, compared to someone who just literally just started getting it and they're like at a 10. So like, and this is just one example, I guess, like this just hit me because when we're talking about differences. So yes, medical records are important, but at the same time, like where they would need to include other confounding factors. And you can't really, I mean, yes, you should be able to control for these things, but you can't dismiss it because these things are real variables that actually, because as soon as they give birth, they're gonna have 3 to 6 months of horrible MS. So their severity is gonna like quadruple at that point. So there are a lot of biological, physiological factors which need to be taken into account. So it's just like adding on to what's been said, that there are differences that are not being taken into account. And this is also one-sided because men don't get pregnant. So that's another thing. You can't compare males to females in that category either. So it'll have to be specific as well. So yeah, that's my 2 cents right there.
That's super interesting. I didn't know about pregnancy and MS, but I mean, if women are more affected by MS, and then there are these like sex-specific protective effects that must be hormonal, like estrogen or something, I feel like they should be like the only paper. Like we should really just have women in there. But yeah, I don't know. Even papers like this are like, you know, one-off. So more research.
Yeah, I mean, you can have that those such studies should exist. Like I do my research on autism spectrum disorder, and that autism affects males to females 4-to-1. So my papers that I'm working on, it's basically we only use male rats, just because that's the population that's affected more. That'll give us more data. They'll give us things, ideal situation, who's affected the most, how does it affect them? So yes, but then you'll have to turn around. We look at the pharma papers come out. Most of them are men. How does it affect a woman? How does this medication affect a woman? So you'll have the same thing thrown back at it. So you'll have to have a balance of both. But yes, like you do need papers specifically targeting the populations affected the most, just to get clarity without having to compare apples to oranges, even though they're both fruit. It's not the same.
Yeah, you're totally right. That should be the next paper. You're assigned. Go do it.
I will get back to you after my boards.
I also think, because like, you know, my research, I do work with like a preclinical post-traumatic stress disorder model. And so, you know, as Hassan was mentioning or alluding to, a lot of the preclinical studies that are published are primarily in males. And again, like I do, even though we have some pathologies that affect one sex over the other preferentially, I still think it's important to include both of them, but also acknowledge that they are different. Like there are different biological, physiological factors that go into play. And so and again, I think that's, you know, with the multivariate linear regression model, you can kind of assess for that. I mean, my knowledge of this is like totally not my full statistics, but like, I do feel like you can incorporate both of them there. One, just kind of building off of that, one question that I also had, I thought was really interesting, is I wonder how this measure does correlate to like biological factors that we do know of. So like amyloid beta or tau tangles, like is there any sort of correlation between the SDMT score and that, or are there different, because, you know, just tying it back to last journal club, we talked about that burden and subjective cognitive concerns. And so, you know, I mean, Gallagher can talk to you more about that. That was his presentation, but essentially it was you know, it was just very interesting to hear about that.
Yeah, that would be something that would be great here, to kind of have that validation in some kind of quantitative aspect. I think that's what I feel like we're all looking for at this point, just to say that, because we can see that something's different, something is off, but why is it different? How is it off? We don't really get that answer, and we're making conclusions, we're drawing from it. But at the end of the day, we also know that this is just what it is because we don't actually understand the whole thing.
I will chime in here. I worked in an MS lab for 2 years before I came to my MD PhD program, and we know for sure there's association with brain lesions and brain volume, and I believe my lab ran a program where they were quantifying the volume of the lesion. So I was using those lesion volumes specifically to look at the relationship between that and SDMT that we were developing in our lab. And when you controlling for motor factors, even they do jump out as the strongest association. So that was why I was concerned about the way the authors drew their conclusions and showing that there were race differences without showing, what did the lesions look like, the brain volume look like when these patients came in, because you put those into your model, and my guess is you'll probably see those jump out way more than any other factors that they included.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's what their question was. I think their question was much more simple, and that's probably why they didn't use so many controls. I think they're really just trying to tease apart this one cognitive test that is kind of ubiquitous and just look at race in a population. MS is probably not the best population, but honestly, I think if they did it in Alzheimer's or something where lesions are predominant, like it's very variable also between patients, I think that would have been really tough. But I'm not quite sure what the ideal population would have been to accentuate that race is not causal to cognition. Maybe that's the biggest thing, is like in my mind, I guess, is like, who else would you have asked this question for to assess just a race difference, accounting for other basic SES things.
That's awesome. Well, Anne, thank you so much. This has been a great journal club, great presentation, great discussion afterwards. Thank you, all of you guys. We're going to schedule another one. We're trying to get one again for March. I know that's in a couple of weeks, but there'll definitely probably be one more in March, and then back to get to a regular schedule again once we get back to April. But thank you guys for coming, and have a great night.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Fantastic presentation.
I will